Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third annual Ruth Chaifetz Memorial Lecture. I'm excited to be here, and I just want to say I'm excited for everybody else who is here because I know that today is a tough day for everybody to be here, and I'm really appreciative that everybody came out to honor Ima Riki, my mother. She was important to me and a lot of the people here, and the reason why I'm not postponing today is because she always taught me, don't put off till tomorrow what you can do today. And I don't want to miss out on this important opportunity to study this important mitzvah. So without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful speaker today, Shmuel Hain, Rabbi Shmuel Hain, who is our rabbi from Young Israel of North Riverdale. And I'll read his bio in a second, but I just want to say I've been trying to get Rabbi Hain to do this, and he wasn't able to do it last year, so I'm glad we could get him to do it this year. And this mitzvah is his expertise, so I'm really excited to discuss it with him. So Rabbi Shmuel Hain is a pulpit rabbi and educator under his leadership since 2006. YIOZ Young Israel of North Riverdale completed a major expansion project and transformed into a vibrant synagogue. As Roche-based Beit Midrash of the Torah Sheba Al Peh at SAR High School. He chairs the TSPEP, say that fast, Gemara department, mentors the Beit Midrash fellows, and teaches advanced Judaic studies classes. During the summer, he serves as the Rav Machaneh, camp rabbi of Camp Moshevat Indian Orchard. A congregational rabbi who is passionate about Jewish scholarship, Rabbi Hain was awarded the Daniel Jeremy Silver Fellowship at Harvard University Center for Jewish Studies for the 2020-2021 academic year. He was then appointed visiting scholar at CJS for the spring 2022 semester. His research and teaching at Harvard integrated academic, halachic, and pastoral perspectives on the Jewish laws of mourning. He has since published several scholarly and more popular articles on the subject. Rabbi Hain was also the recipient of a Elite Fellowship for the 24-25 academic year at the Harvard Center for Advanced Judaic Studies and the University of Pennsylvania. He has co-authored and edited several volumes of Torah and academic scholarship, including a volume in the Orthodox Forum series entitled The Next Generation of Modern Orthodoxy. I'll just have to say that Rabbi Hain sent me this article that he wrote. If anybody is interested in reading it, I'll be happy to send it out afterwards. It's very, very insightful and definitely worth the 20 minutes or so that it will take you to read it. Maybe more if you're a slow reader, but I thought it was really interesting, and so I just went through it kind of fast. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Rabbi Hain. He will give us a quick intro on stringency versus leniency in mourning. And then we'll move into an interview style discussion. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to post them in the chat and we will bring them up. Rabbi Hain, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And it's great to be giving this shiur. It's really a hard moment for everyone in Israel and also for those of us who are not in Israel who care deeply about what's going on in Israel and or have family there. I've been in touch with my kids who live in Herzliya and who have been running in and out of shelters over the last few days, and know that it's a difficult moment. So I, on top of what's been a very difficult period for more than a year and a half at this point, I'm really honored to give this talk and to discuss various issues with Rebecca in memory of her mom. The Saltons were a big part of our community for several years, and we've stayed connected over the years, and thrilled to be able to talk about important things. And as Rebecca mentioned, I've spent a lot of time thinking about aveilut, not just as someone who tries to provide comfort to people during their times of mourning, but also through our own experiences. My father-in-law passed away very suddenly almost 10 years ago, and that really began some of my deeper dive into this area of halacha. And a lot of what I'm going to share in this brief intro originated in conversations I had with Shari during that time and in her experience of aveilut. She was not someone who went to shul every day and said Kaddish 3 times a day or even once a day. She actually didn't find reciting Kaddish particularly meaningful. She has a brother who said Kaddish dutifully for their father, and she found other ways and continues to find other ways to uh, continue her father's legacy and mark his yahrzeit. This year we'll be marking his 10th yahrzeit over Chol Hamoed Sukkot, and we're still figuring out exactly how we want to do that. I want to talk a little bit about leniency and stringency in aveilut. I might pull up the screen share in just a minute to give us a little bit of a context for it. This is an issue that I've struggled with and done a lot of research on because I just felt like something was a little bit off in how I was taught about it and how people experience stringency and leniency when it comes to matters relating to mourning. We normally think when you can be lenient, that means you do less of it. And there is a principle that comes up several places in the Talmud called Halacha Kedivrei Hamekel Ba'avel. The law follows the lenient view when it comes to mourning. What the reason for that is, we're not going to get into fully at the moment, and the history of that. You can read that article that I published that Rebecca said she would share with people. But what I have found most interesting is trying to define exactly what leniency and stringency means when it comes to mourning and when it comes to the laws of aveilut. And I'll give 2 quick examples. I had one example this year of a woman who was in the process of divorcing her husband. And it was a second marriage for each of them, and they had a period of time where the marriage was um, warm and supportive and healthy and meaningful. And then through a series of events, including COVID, they decided to part ways and to get divorced. And they were in the process of getting divorced when the husband, soon to be ex-husband, suddenly passed away. And the question that the soon to be ex-wife posed to me was, should she observe Shiva and other mourning practices? And it's a really interesting question just from a academic perspective and also from a psychological perspective. There's a whole category of mourning called disenfranchised grief, which refers to people who are not necessarily direct mourners or people who are not defined by the general public as people who should be mourning for someone who passes away, and how sometimes that's a difficult situation to be in. And so the technical halacha is that there's a machloket, there's a debate about whether or not someone who is in the process of getting divorced in the final stages uh, of just days or weeks away from having a get separating and ending the marriage from a religious perspective, whether they should observe mourning. And this was a case where I really struggled with what was lenient and what was stringent, because in many ways she continued to feel a real connection to her soon-to-be ex-husband, and there were reasons why she wanted to practice. She was taking care of many of the funeral arrangements. She was consulting with me on the language of the tombstone. There were lots of parts of this where she was really integral to the mourning process. She was still close with her stepson, who was the only family member who was actually sitting Shiva. So it became a real question for me, and in advising this woman about how to navigate this. And the other case, which I talk about in that article that Rebecca referenced, was a case during COVID where a woman in my shul who was a Holocaust survivor lost her 67-year-old son to COVID right before Pesach. And she was advised by a rabbi, uh, who was the rabbi of her living son's community, that because she wasn't attending the funeral, even though the funeral was going to be held over Pesach, she could observe Shiva, quote unquote, right before Pesach for a couple of hours, and then the holiday would end it. And because the law follows the lenient view in mourning, she wouldn't really have to sit Shiva. And the other position would have been that if she waited until after the burial took place, she would end up sitting Shiva following the conclusion of Pesach. And the woman followed the advice of her son's rabbi, and she called me up over Pesach, over Chol HaMoed, really devastated that she didn't get a chance to talk about her son and to really sit Shiva. And even though it was COVID, we were doing some outdoor Shivas, we were doing some other things. And so I advised her then to have unofficial visits from friends and family members during that week following Pesach. And that was another example where strictly applying the idea that the law follows the lenient view in mourning actually made for a more difficult emotional experience, and that she was looking for the opportunity to mourn and to sit Shiva, and exempting her from that actually had negative consequences. And so this is all by way of background to say it's tricky when it comes specifically to the laws of aveilut in particular, to know how to define what's stringent and what's lenient. For some people, a leniency is experienced as a stringency of not allowing them to mourn in the way that they wanted to mourn. So I want to just share the original source in the Gemara with you and read through that to show how I think the Gemara is actually quite sensitive to this phenomenon, and provides for us a way of understanding this principle in a nuanced and individualized and an agile kind of way. And that halacha k'divrei mekel ba'aval, rather than being a blanket rule, which means follow the most lenient view and do the least amount of mourning possible, actually means we need to tailor the mourning practices so long as there is a perspective that supports the view for the individual mourner. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Give me a second just to figure this out. Hold on one second.
So while you're doing it, I'll just say from a practical standpoint, one of the things that will always definitely help to make sure that you're getting the right information when you talk to your rabbi is to understand these sort of things before you even talk to him, and also make sure you have his correct email address, or else you won't get a response.
Yes, that's definitely
Personal experience. I know that if you don't
practical guidance, that's very important. So there are two parts to the Gemara that I want to talk about. This principle of leniency in mourning comes up in 4 or 5 different places in the one chapter of the Talmud where the laws of mourning are discussed most at length, the 3rd chapter in Moed Katan. But the Gemara's immediate
Rabbi Hain,
context.
sorry, we can't see your screen.
Oh, okay.
Just says
Thank
you
you.
started screen sharing, but I think you didn't select the screen that you want to share.
Yeah, let me try to do that a little bit better. Okay, hold on one second. Let me do that. How am I doing now?
Yes, now you're good. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. So the immediate context where it first comes up is actually in a discussion about cutting one's fingernails during Shiva, a very practical grooming, hygiene kind of question. And the Gemara there in Moed Katan on 17b to 18a on Yud Zayin Amabet to Yud Chad Amud Aleph cites a machloket about whether or not one is permitted to cut one's fingernails during Shiva. The comparison is Chol HaMoed, and that's the subject of many of the discussions in that chapter, comparing and contrasting some of the laws of Chol HaMoed with the laws of Shiva. And the Gemara concludes pretty emphatically that one is permitted to cut one's fingernails during Shiva. We'll see in a moment the Gemara then complicates this with a story, and the eventual psak halacha is that you're not supposed to use like a nail clipper for it. Um, but if your nails are long, you can, use your fingers or bite your nails or whatever it is, in lieu of using a nail clipper. But that's not the part that I find most interesting about this Gemara. What happens in this Gemara, and I separated here just to kind of be able to follow how there's this halachic discussion, and then the Gemara tells a story. And I'm going to read that story in Hebrew and translate it into English, and then kind of offer some concluding comments to this intro, and then happy to have a conversation with Rebecca and answer other people's questions as well. So the Gemara, following this statement of Shmuel, I guess my namesake, says that we follow the lenient view when it comes to mourning, tells a story where this principle was put into action by Shmuel himself, who was advising his brother Pinchas. I believe it was his younger brother. Pinchas achua de Mar Shmuel itra be milta. The Gemara here uses euphemistic language to basically say Pinchas was sitting shiva, probably for a child, possibly for his spouse, but it was somebody that Pinchas was sitting shiva for, whom Shmuel, his brother, was not sitting shiva for. Al Shmuel lemishal tamamine. Shmuel went to pay a shiva visit. The Gemara uses this unusual phrase to ask him the reason, and maybe it foreshadows that this story is not going to go so well, because when you go to a shiva house, you probably shouldn't ask the person, hey, how come your loved one died? And Shmuel's initial words to him are not words of comfort, but they are picking up on the last piece of the Gemara, focusing on fingernails. Chazanu litufre dahavu nefishin. Shmuel observes that Pinchas's nails are exceedingly long. Amar le, and he says to him, Shmuel, who's I interpret as kind of the scholar of the family, says to his brother, who is not a well-known scholar, Amai lo shakaltlahu. How come you didn't cut your fingernails? Why are you sitting there like that? Amar le, and Pinchas responds to him, Ibidi de have. If you were the one sitting shiva, mi mizalzalet be kulehai, would you treat this matter so lightly? I interpret that to Pinchas saying, this is the way I'm grieving. I don't want to focus on keeping my grooming and other things up. For me, this is an expression of grief for my loved one that I'm sitting shiva for. Don't come here and tell me how I should observe my mourning. For you, this is an essential act of hygiene. But for me, this is an important expression of showing that I am mourning a loved one. And the Gemara goes on and says that Pinchas uttered these words, and sure enough, Shmuel was then sitting shiva. And Pinchas goes to see him, and Shmuel, of course, had, according to following his own ruling, cut his fingernails, and he throws the fingernails back into Pinchas's face and says, did you have to open your mouth? And suggests that I would be sitting shiva. So this, it's tragic, but it's also a tragic comedy a bit. The Gemara here is kind of deliberately telling a story which is kind of out there. But what I think it's really showing us is that one person's stringency is another person's leniency. And so for Shmuel, telling his brother what to do in this context actually led to disaster and led to them having this fight over how to properly mourn. And so one of the things that we need to be sensitive to, and why I think the Gemara tells this story immediately on the heels of sharing this principle, is to tell us that this principle is not a cudgel. It's not a verbal cudgel that we use to tell people they have to adopt the most lenient view. What it really is supposed to be is a message about how to take into account the individual circumstances and feelings of the mourner when it comes to advising about which particular position to adopt. And this I've taken to heart over the last 10 years when I have worked with mourners. And my first question, often back to them when they ask a question, is, how do you feel about this particular thing? You were invited to a simcha and it's 9 months after your parent died. How do you feel about attending? Are you going to be comfortable there? And together working with them to figure out what exactly is the best way for them to honor the legacy of their parent, while at the same time participating as a close friend or family member in whatever simcha it is. Another example, I kept on telling my wife when she was in her year mourning for her father that there really is no prohibition of going to a movie during Yud Bet Chodesh. It's one of those things that became popular in some circles, that you don't go to movies. And my wife resisted, and at a certain point I said to her, like, why don't you want to go to a movie? And she said to me, I'm not saying Kaddish for my father. I'm not doing certain other practices. This is a meaningful way for me to mark the fact that my father is no longer part of my life. Stop telling me how I should mourn my father. This is meaningful for me. And so I think the lesson that I wanted to just start with is that when it comes to mourning practices, the Gemara and Halacha have given us an incredible gift of mourning practices to help guide us. And in most cases, people find deep, deep meaning and psychological support through the mourning practices. And one of the things we need to be conscious of is make sure that when we're adopting those mourning practices, we don't just follow the lenient view and do the least amount of mourning. But what Halacha Kedivri HaMekel Ba'avel really teaches us is that we're supposed to adopt the view, the accepted view, within the range of positions that are raised, that most takes into account the individual circumstances of that mourner and helps them um, go through the mourning process in a way which will lead to grief that will be less complicated, that will be less painful in the long run. So that's the short idea that I wanted to begin with. And now I'm happy to have a conversation with Rebecca and with all of you about some of the details of mourning that you've been wondering about.
Okay, well, just so we can be clear about what exactly we're talking about, let's go through, first of all, the different stages of being a mourner, because there's a lot of them, and there's like the before and there's the after. And I think that if we could just clarify in this way as we're going through different
Great.
practices, it will be helpful to everyone.
Good. And that's also helpful because this principle doesn't apply across the board. So that's important. So when someone loses one of their seven close relatives, that's mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, or spouse, they are obligated to mourn. And the first stage of mourning is actually called aninut, not aveilut. That's the stage between the time of death and the time of burial. I just had a case Friday. Someone was flying to Israel on a plane Thursday night with their loved one, with their deceased loved one, and the plane got turned around. And so they wanted to know, now that they don't know exactly when the burial is going to take place, what are they? Like, what mourning practices should they observe? It's nuts. So aninut is a stage of aveilut where you're supposed to be completely focused on making sure the burial of the deceased takes place. It's quite unusual in that during that stage, one is exempt and told not to perform positive commandments like davening, like benching, like brachot, blessings and the like. It doesn't pertain on Shabbat and Yom Tov because those are days when you can't do burial anyway. But on weekdays, since people are supposed to be focused on the needs of the deceased and burying the deceased, we're supposed to be less focused on our own religious uh, life. And so you're not allowed to eat pig or something, but you are indeed restricted from performing positive commandments so that you can keep your focus on the needs of the deceased. That's also a time where we don't say that we're lenient, because when it comes to kavod hamet, when it comes to honor and dignity of the deceased, that's not something that we say you should take and adopt a lenient view. You're actually supposed to, in most cases, make sure that you focus on the deceased. So you're not even supposed to say, well, I can manage putting on tefillin or reciting Shmona Esrei even while I'm in this stage. We say, actually, no, you're exempt, and it's somewhat of an affront to the deceased to shift your focus away from their needs to your own religious practices. So that's the first stage. And then following burial, in a conventional case, usually it's the day of or the day after, you transition into aveilut, classic mourning practices, where there are a number of restrictions which are supposed to allow you to focus on channeling your grief and your sense of uh, being in a place that no one can fully understand in that moment your loss and the like. And so we manifest that through a number of practices that kind of seem unhygienic, no bathing for pleasure, no cutting of hair, a prohibition on sexual relations. You're not supposed to greet people or be greeted by people during the week of Shiva. It's a very unusual time where you're supposed to be focused on your own grief for the deceased, and the community kind of comes to you to allow you to talk about the deceased and begin to the process of mourning. That's the Shiva period. And that then transitions after Shiva, after a week of mourning, into the Shloshim, which is a 30-day mourning period, where most of those restrictions are lifted. There's still restrictions on haircuts and some other matters, but purchasing new clothes and the like. But the 30-day mourning period kind of goes from the intensity of Shiva to kind of reintegrating back into society over the course of the month. And then in a case of a parent, and only in the case of a parent, which is an interesting phenomenon, there is a 12-month mourning period. Typically 11 months where you say Kaddish. We don't say, well, again, for relatives who are going to say Kaddish, it's usually for 11 months. But the 12-month mourning period is really about kibud avaim. It's really about honoring one's parents' memory, and there are even fewer restrictions or practices during that period. Primarily, it's about avoiding large-scale celebrations. Some people try to refrain from any significant purchase which would generate feelings of real joy on the level that would recite a bracha of Shechianu, and that's kind of the 12-month period of mourning. So those are the key stages over the course of aveilut. And again, there are exceptions to the rule. Holidays end Shiva and Shloshim prematurely, which can sometimes be challenging for people who are looking to have the mourning period, like in the case that I talked about with the woman whose son died on Erev Pesach. Our family had the opposite situation where my father-in-law died in Chol Hamoed Sukkot, and we couldn't begin the Shiva process until after the holiday of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. So my wife and her brother had to delay their Shiva for 4 or 5 days until after the holiday ended, which was, the truncated version of Shiva is one challenge, and the delayed onset of Shiva is a different type of challenge. So that's like a thumbnail sketch of the mourning process. Aninut, to aveilut, within aveilut shiva shloshim yud bet chodesh.
Okay, so that's really helpful. So what do you wish that people knew more about in terms of onen and aveilut? Like, is there something, even though you gave us a basic, layout, is there something that people should know specifically about those time periods in terms of how they can be more prepared? Because I'm all about preparation.
Yeah. So again, this is really an interesting, almost a separate topic, which is there's like this taboo around death, generally in Western civilization that started in the last, um, probably in the last 100 years or so. I think World War I, there's a lot of scholarship on when people started sending away their ill relatives to a hospital or somewhere else to die, we became much less comfortable around death and became very avoidant of death. And part of that taboo is like we don't like talking about it in advance. And there is this notion that people, I think, overplay that to even speak about death before a person dies, there's it's halachically problematic, and I don't think that's the case. It is true that some of these areas of halacha were less studied, probably because there were some superstitions around it. But I think that's a shame. It's a little bit like the practice that people have to run out of shul for Yisker, which also is a pet peeve of mine. I am not into superstitious uh, views of Judaism. My parents are alive and well, and I've been staying in for Yisker my entire rabbinic career. It has not, had an adverse effect. Uh, you
Funny
know,
that you bring up Yisker because actually I was discussing that with someone over Shabbos, and he said to me, he's like, I think people should stay in on Yisker because especially if you're in a young community and you have like only one person there, like what are
yeah,
you then they're all alone? And also like there are other people you can say Yisker
yeah,
for
yeah.
that,
So
yeah.
I'm I'm
I
I'm a
found
huge
fascinating. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of that. But I'll say, even in my own shul, I've tried to do that at various times. People are really, averse to doing that. So I now, really encourage people who feel that they must leave to do so quietly. When I was a rabbi at the Jewish Center in Manhattan, I kind of oversaw the young professionals minyan, and we literally had one handful of people who were saying Yisker, and the building was so full that it was a fire hazard for everyone to go out. So I ordered people to stay in and encouraged them to say Yisker for a grandparent, a great grandparent, to say a tefillah for the health of their parents during that time, to close their eyes and just meditate, whatever it is. Yeah, again, it's a very strange practice, which it has endured in the modern Orthodox community that people really just get wigged out about. And again, I think part of that it also leads to people not being prepared for when they encounter
100%.
grief. And so, one of the things that I think is important, and one of my own personal missions, is for people to become more educated about grieving practice, especially since so many people now are not like the situation we had with my father-in-law, where he passed away very suddenly, but where there is a decline, where there's cognitive issues, where there's cancer, and you have the time to kind of anticipate what's going to be. And in those situations, I think it's really halachically and psychologically important to figure out how to navigate the right balance of taking advantage of the time you have left with the person and living those moments fully, but also talking with them about what they want their funeral to look like, what they want their shiva to look like, what they want their kids to do during their Yud Bet Chodesh. What would my parent have wanted? Would they have wanted me to go to my cousin's wedding and celebrate, or would they want me to just go to the chuppah and then leave? You can have those kinds of conversations. Sometimes you're given the gift of knowing that a person is declining, even if we don't know the exact moment. And I think the idea that we avoid any discussion of that. Obviously, one shouldn't have a conversation with someone when they're not yet ready to have that conversation. And you have to figure that out with the help of loved ones and rabbis, advisors, mental health professionals. But I've had situations where it was extremely helpful for kids, adult children, young adult children whose parents were dying of cancer, to be able to have real conversations about what they hoped for their kids and what they wanted their funerals to look like and what they wanted their the mourning practices to look like. So I guess one overall message I would share that I wish people would take heed of is that it's not all taboo. It's not, you're not hastening someone's death by talking about what their wishes are for after they die. We purchase plots, most of us, we write wills. We should be doing those kinds of things. And in the world, I think that in our world now, there's a really important organization called Amatai, based out of Israel, run by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, where they really help with end of life issues, healthcare proxies, living wills, and those kinds of things. Because if we avoid talking about those things, it just very often yields to fighting amongst family members and really kind of negative consequences in the long term.
Great. I'm with you. I talk to my dad about it all the time. And I tell my kids things too. I actually, my boys are Kohanim, my husband's a Kohen. So my daughter and I are, this sounds weird, but we always go to funerals together. So we're
Right.
funeral. So every time we go to the cemetery, I'm like, listen, that's a nice one. I don't like that one. Like we just have that discussion and it makes it very casual, which seems weird, but actually it's easier for us to talk about. So I'm with you on that one. Okay, so are there any specific ways that halachot of onen and aveilut or avel differ for men and women?
So that's an interesting question. Nothing comes to mind um,
I have
right
one
away.
particular example, which if you'll allow me,
Yeah,
lighting
please.
Shabbos candles. Because for a woman who misses out on lighting Shabbos candles, then there's like this practice, and maybe this is made up too, I don't know, but there's this practice of lighting additional candles miss a time. So is that
Right.
what is happening there if someone dies Erev Shabbos, let's say, and you can't bury them before Shabbos?
Okay. Good question. So in that case, once late Friday hits, you probably are no longer an Onain and you would be obligated to light Shabbat candles. So that's not a situation where, you would have, but if you didn't or couldn't, that wouldn't be a case. Most of the authorities that talk about that practice you use the idea that if you deliberately or in a negligent way missed it. But if for a halachic reason you missed it, it wouldn't be the kind of thing that you would have to make up for. I also don't think that that's again, that's also another superstitious kind of practice that I'm not a huge fan of. The just to answer some of the questions that came up, there is a prohibition of studying Torah during the week of Shiva. It's not clear. There's a debate about whether some of the mourning practices during the week of Shiva apply to an onain. An onain is not allowed to eat meat or drink wine, in contrast to an avel who is permitted to do those things. But all the practices of aveilut, there's a debate amongst the Rishonim about whether or not they're prohibited during aninut. And when it comes to studying of Torah, we actually encourage those beginning the mourning process in aninut to restrict themselves to those matters which relate to the laws of mourning. So there are, even for mourners during Shiva, permitted areas of study, basically those relating to the mourning practices and the like. And that's why shuls will often give, or communities will often give books related to mourning practices for people to read during the week of Shiva. Sometimes it's hard to do that, and but that's typically what we advise, and that we don't study other parts of Torah because one of the things of Torah is that it gladdens the soul, and it's Pikudei Hashem Yesharim Misamchei Lev, and so we try to avoid anything which will cause extra joy during that period of time.
Um, how can mourners, especially women, feel empowered to ask for leniency without guilt? And I guess this would apply in both stages, both the pre and post burial.
Yeah, I think this is really important, and this is why it is important to have a relationship um, with a spiritual mentor, a clergy person, a rabbi, and it's a little more difficult in Israel than it is in America because I think sometimes the system in Israel there aren't as many kind of vo community rabbis who are connected to a specific congregation. But the answer to the question is people should do the best they can to try to connect and to explain their individual circumstances. And I think that's critical for, and if you don't have a rabbinic advisor or mentor who takes those things into account, it's probably good to find someone who does and who will appreciate the those kinds of individual types of circumstances. And I think part of my message in the opening was the strict binary of lenient versus stringent is out the window when it comes to the laws of mourning. So asking something is not asking for a leniency, it's actually trying to figure out what is the best way for me to navigate this period and to mourn and to grieve properly and to hopefully at the conclusion of this halachic process to be able to love my the departed loved one in a different way than we have while they were alive, but to make that grief less complicated and less fraught. And to do that, sometimes it means adopting what's, objectively more stringent, and sometimes it's what's more lenient. One of the things that drives me crazy is when rabbis like give specific numbers of couples you are allowed to have a Shabbat meal with. Like like two couples is okay, but once it's three couples, it's too much. So first of all, on Shabbat, you're not supposed to be publicly mourning anyway. But second of all, for different people, having support systems in different kinds of configurations play into this. My kids are in Israel in a community in Herzliya without any parents, without any adults around. They're adults, but they're young adults, without any 40s and 50s around. And so I've told my kids when they've had people in their community who are mourning that they have to invite them for meals with other people because that's their family while they're there. Those are the people who are holding them up, and to isolate them further socially when they're going through a difficult time is counter to what the halacha wants. So I think it's important to just say it the way you said it, Rebecca, which is help people feel empowered to have real conversations where they share how they're feeling and what they feel will be the best way for them to proceed. Now, sometimes that's hard for people because they want to be told what to do. Rabbi, I want you to tell me, am I allowed to do this or am I not allowed to do this? And I frustrate people sometimes when I say to them, I don't want to give you that answer without first talking with you about what you feel and about how important is it for you to go to this simcha. Are you going to feel comfortable there? Are you going to feel like you're doing something that what you don't want to be doing? And so I think rabbis need to empower their congregants and the people that their students to let them know that in this area of halacha especially, their individual circumstances really dictates what practices we should follow.
I have to say, to your credit, I felt like when we had discussions about what was acceptable or not acceptable in terms of what I was doing during my year of mourning, I felt that the halacha, I mean, was so flexible. It's like, what do you feel? Which I don't find in any other part of halacha really, that it's so flexible and focused on like comforting the person as much. But I did really feel like that was the goal, to really just make me feel comfortable.
Yeah,
And
so
and
I think I think that's what halacha k'divrei hamekel ba'avel in its, ideal form means, that people will feel as if their individual circumstances helped shape exactly how they mourn. That doesn't mean you don't mourn. Sometimes, like I said, it means you adopt more stringent positions if you feel like that's the best way to go. My wife didn't want to go see movies in a movie theater. And I sit there like, what's the difference between a movie theater and watching something on your computer? For her, that felt very different, and she wanted to mark the mourning in that way. And it took me a while to understand that and more fully appreciate it.
for me, it was similar. It was the public versus the private aspect of it. Like it would almost look insulting to my mother if I did something like that in public.
Right,
I think
right.
that's what it comes down to, and it's that for me, anyways. That was the feeling that I got. Anyway, okay. So, what are some common misconceptions about what women can and cannot do during halacha? I mean, I'll be totally honest with you. I read two really long books. I had mourning, so I prepared myself, and I read two really long books before my mom passed away about halacha and mourning and what I was supposed to do. And when the time came, I still felt totally unprepared, and because I felt like these didn't really address women. And so, like, there were things like, okay, don't shave your beard. Okay, well,
Right,
that doesn't, I mean, it kind of doesn't apply for me. I don't know,
right.
like, like what am I? And especially once I had to go to the mikvah, in the shloshim, it was all this very like, okay, what can I do? What can I do? What am I not supposed to like? That was
Great.
very, very confusing. So I want to give clarity around specifically uh, sitting shiva and shloshim and beyond about what is acceptable for women in terms of personal hygiene and appearance.
Okay, good. So one of the things that's really important, and here's like a popular misconception, is the prohibition relating to bathing and washing is really bathing and washing for pleasure, or that doesn't serve um, any kind of medical or hygiene, kind of any hygienic kind of purpose. And so one of the things and this is also an area where the halacha has evolved, even in the last 50 years, but certainly from when there were public bathhouses to now. Um, People now shower more frequently, and it's not like luxurious to shower daily. It's pretty standard. And so I advise mourners, male and female, that they should take a quick, cool rinse. Not a regular shower with the hot water, and where they spend 10 minutes in the shower. But again, I know me personally, I feel if I've gone 24 hours without showering, that like I stink and I'm just not clean. And so again, it may not be daily, but depending on how hot it is and how much sitting and how much whatever, I think it's really important to stress that the prohibition of bathing is rechitza shel tanug. It's bathing for pleasure. And for that reason, technically speaking, the bathing associated with going to the mikvah or preparing for the mikvah shouldn't be prohibited during Shiva. There's a separate question when it comes to going to the mikvah during Shiva, which is if because intimate touch and sexual relations are prohibited during Shiva, is a woman permitted to go to the mikvah during her Shiva? The Shulchan Aruch rules against that and says no, since it's like going to the mikvah on Tisha B'Av night or on Yom Kippur night where we don't go to the mikvah. And the explanation for that is it's purposeless, in the sense that because intimate touch isn't permitted, wait till after the fast is over, wait till after the Shiva. I will say that there could be extraordinary circumstances where supportive touch, not sexual touch, not intimate touch, but where supportive touch might be psychologically critically important for that individual, where I could see myself advising someone to follow the view that would permit going to the mikvah and preparing for the mikvah during Shiva. I haven't encountered that in my experience thus far in my life, but I could envision a scenario where I would think that that would be where that would be appropriate. Um, but so that for the Shiva, the black letter law is that women do not prepare for the mikvah or go to the mikvah because it falls into the category of bathing for no real purpose,
Right.
um, even though it's not bathing for pleasure. Um, most women who prepare for the mikvah don't find that, full of pleasure or the mikvah experience itself. During Shloshim, there is a view of the Ramah that some of the practices regarding bathing extend beyond the Shiva into the Shloshim. I do not advise people to observe that, especially nowadays. The idea of like restricting showering over a month is pretty much inconceivable. And certainly when it comes to preparing for the mikvah, and the mikveh itself, there is no issue whatsoever during Shloshim, and certainly not during Yud Bet Chodesh. So really, the only issue pertaining to mikveh is during the Shiva, and as I mentioned, the general practice is to not use the mikveh during Shiva. But again, I could envision a scenario where the circumstances were such that a person could feel they need some physical support, and that could be a situation where that would be permitted. Is that helpful?
Yes. But in that same vein, for women, especially women who don't cover their hair, uh, where men might not take a haircut in the shloshim, maybe there is a time where women would, or that during the whole year, is they're sitting shiva for a parent where they would, what would be acceptable for a woman? And even if she covers her hair, sometimes she needs a haircut. Like,
Right. Oh, the other thing
hard
I
to
didn't
cover your hair if it's
right, right. The other thing I didn't get into was some of the grooming stuff. And again, I think that's a situation where it's not uh, it's not for pleasure, and therefore, shaving one's legs or the like. If you're someone who does that regularly every other day or whatever, and not doing so for a week would make you uncomfortable and the like, there is definitely room to allow that practice. When it comes to hair cutting, it's an interesting thing. There's more permissiveness for those who cover their hair if they're careful to keep almost all of their hair covered. If their hair then gets longer, and that would be that would there are even exceptions to the shloshim normal shloshim prohibition to allow for a trim in that kind of situation. For someone who doesn't cover their hair, I advise people during shloshim not to get haircuts, and not to go to the hair salon. Again, I haven't had too many situations of people who color their hair, and going that period of time would cause kind of a significant impact in terms of their own feeling about themselves and the like. I would imagine there would be circumstances where dyeing hair or the like would be okay. But I think I normally tell people, women during the shloshim, that unless there are extraordinary circumstances, they probably shouldn't, go to the nail salon or go to the hair salon for that period. But once the 30-day period is over, there aren't restrictions on that.
Okay, so since we're closing in on time and I don't want to go over too long, um, what can women do to meaningfully observe a yahrzeit, especially if they are in St. Kaddish? And I did mention something with you this morning. I don't know if you want to bring it up or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. So this is really good. I want to do 2 minutes on this.
Okay.
Every source which talks about the origins of Kaddish has Kaddish as but one example of a life dedicated to learning Torah and observing mitzvot and davening. And we've fetishized Kaddish a little bit. I think there are probably historical reasons for it. It was helpful if you wanted to get a minion in a community to like tell people they have to come say Kaddish 3 times a day. But our focus on Kaddish, especially in those cases where it's not practical for women who, let's say, have young kids and whose husbands are traveling to say Kaddish all the time, or if it's just not the common practice in that community. My wife grew up in a household where her mom never said Kaddish, not ever, and that she didn't ever think of that being a meaningful way. So there are other ways in which you can um, promote the legacy of your loved one. And I think taking on a learning project, taking on a chesed project in conjunction with shloshim or a yahrzeit is as good, if not better, than reciting Kaddish. And what Rebecca asked me there earlier is there is the practice of some to fast on the day of the yahrzeit. And again, if you're a good faster, that might be a very meaningful way to market. My wife's aveilut for her father's on Chol Hamoed Sukkos when you're not allowed to fast, so it's not something that she does. But I think there are lots and lots of ways that we can, with planning, advanced planning, think about how we can mark that particular occasion. And a Torah milestone, studying something and completing it in time for the yard site, or starting a new chesed project, or having a shiur in commemoration of the yard site. Those are all really meaningful ways. I think they're even more meaningful than Kaddish. Why Kaddish became such a significant prayer is the subject for another time, but it's not really about the deceased. It's about God, or about us expressing the idea that the world will in the future be a more whole and more complete place, and that God is with us during this time where we see the brokenness in the world. So Kaddish does have a great deal of meaning, but it's not to the exclusion of a whole suite of religious observances and practices and Torah and mitzvot that one can take on. I have a friend whose father was very into daf yomi, and he died, and he had never done daf yomi in his life, and he decided that he was going to now start doing daf yomi in honor of his father who had died. That's one example. It can be, a tzedakah project that would have been meaningful to your loved one, or some mitzvah, which would have been starting a gamach of some sort. Any one of those things, I think, that's gender neutral, and doesn't involve like ritualized prayer as much.
I wrote a book. It
Yeah.
was actually really cathartic, and I'll just say this about that, which was because I decided that I didn't want to watch movies or listen to the radio or do. I found that I had a lot of free time to focus on it, and it was actually like a very conscientious way of spending time with something I was doing for my mom every day during the aveilut, and it took me longer than the 1 year or the 11 months. And so for me, it was like a really great way to connect with my mother. Anyway, if there are no other questions, I will say thank you so much to Rabbi Hain. During this perilous time for Israel, continue to pray for us here, pray for all of the Jewish people's safety everywhere, and for the speedy return of our soldiers and our hostages. and may we merit to see the coming of Mashiach very soon. Thank you so much for coming. And if anybody has any questions, I will post the replay, and also I'll put Rabbi Hain's information in the replay materials, and you can feel free to reach out to him. Thank you so much,
Yes.
Rabbi Hain.
Thank you.
Everybody have a beautiful week. Stay safe, and may we have lots of peace.
Yes.